everyone, and a massive welcome to the next episode of the CISO Experience. My name's Simon Lindstead. I'm the host and founder of the Infosec Live community. And for those of you that have tuned in this week, what a week it's been. 7 live streams so far, both on YouTube and LinkedIn, with so much knowledge and insight gained from our industry's leaders. It's been super exciting, a massive learning curve from me. And to be honest with you, the amount of you jumping in the chat over the last week has blown me away and made all of our sessions super engaging. And today's session, we're finishing the week on a really special one. But before I move on to that, bit of housekeeping. If you're watching this live, please do like and subscribe. Please jump in the comments. We're going to try and take questions as we go. And if you're watching this on the replay, again, thanks again for tuning in. Please make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of future content. And for those of you that haven't seen any of the shows before or don't know anything about the Infosec Live community, we're a community of 3,000 cyber professionals, all sharing best ideas and practice. And we've been around since June last year, and we're the first, or I believe the world's first dedicated security social network. So we're absolutely free. And this show has been created to help further the sharing of best ideas and practice with our leaders and beyond, you know, right down to those of you who are trying to break into the industry at the moment. And the reason our community is free and offers tons of support to all our members is only possible thanks to the support of our sponsor, Bramfit Technology Labs. So bit about Bramfit. Bramfit are an international cybersecurity consultancy leading the way in innovation and cyber resilience, with offices in New York, London, and Perth. And their entire team is owner managed and works on a linear structure, drawing expertise from the military, government, finance, and technology industries. And together they provide support and collaboration to those who protect assets and sensitive company data. They're leading in technical cyber consulting and focused on embedding a culture of security with its clients. And through research, education, and execution, Bramfit helps you to protect your systems and, of course, importantly, your reputation. And as their CEO, Lewis, says, if you're a CISO suffering from Big Four fatigue, reach out to Bramfit today and see how they can help. The link for them will be in the comments, but the most important thing about this show is the guests. So let's move on to who we've got today. And we're super lucky to have Jack Jones. And for those of you that aren't aware of who he is, Jack's worked in information security for over 35 years, 10 of which as a CISO with 3 different companies, including a Fortune 100 company. His work was recognized in 2006 with the ISSA Excellence in the Field of Security Practices Award. And in 2012, Jack received the CSO Compass Award for Risk Management Leadership. He's also had the privilege of being on the ISACA task force that created the original RiskIT framework, and he led the development of ISACA's CRISC certification program. As an adjunct professor at Carnegie Mellon University, he teaches in the CRO and CISO executive programs, and Jack also created the factor analysis of information risk, also known as FAIR model, which has been adopted as an international standard. But currently, Jack's the chief risk scientist at RiskLens and chairman of the FAIR Institute, an award-winning global non-profit organization with over 13,000 members worldwide. Not only that, he's also co-authored a book on FAIR entitled Measuring and Managing Information Risk, A Fair Approach, which was inducted into the cybersecurity canon back in 2016. So everyone, let's make this as interactive as possible. Let's waste no further time and let's bring Jack on for that chat. Jack, a massive thank you for coming on the show today. I hope I got that right.
You did. Yep. Everything there is factual. Yes.
Good. So now the hard facts. Firstly, massive thanks for coming on and giving up your time. It's much appreciated. I suppose to fill in around those hard facts, what about the soft bits, the soft facts, which are the important ones? Let's talk about your journey and how it started before we begin on anything else, if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, I started in a very technical role way back when, before the internet was a thing, and cut my teeth in the security realm when viruses first raised their ugly little heads. And I worked at a bank at the time, and I was in a meeting, and they talked about this thing called a computer virus, and did anybody want to be responsible for dealing with it in the company? That sounds interesting. I had a medical background, so yeah, maybe. And, quickly realized that I'd found my home. It really, the whole notion of protecting and solving hard problems really, resonated with me. So, and at the time, of course, there was very little information available on viruses. So I thought, what better way to learn them than to write one? So I wrote a virus that, of course, I never released. It didn't have a destructive payload anyway, but just in my own little lab, and learned a lot from that, and established a hobby of disassembling viruses that were in the wild, and learned a ton from the smart but misguided people who were writing them. And it just evolved from there, again, with a focus on very technical roles, attack and penetration work and that sort of thing, security architecture, and then essentially stumbled into my first CISO role at a Fortune 100 company. Apparently the bar was not very high at the time for qualifications, and I was not qualified, but I was surrounded by good people and patient people above me, and learned some hard lessons relatively quickly. Like, for instance, what executives cared about was risk. They didn't care about security, they cared about risk. And I had no answers for them, which is what drove me to develop FAIR, so that I could understand their perspective, evaluate the problem space in those terms, communicate with those executives in those terms. And that was really the beginning of, that's been so far now a 20-year journey, 21-year journey from the first point of awakening, if you will, to risk. And as you said, I've been a CISO for 3 different companies, where I continue to evolve FAIR and apply it with, tremendous success in terms of the things it was enabling me to do, the answers I could provide for management and those sorts of things. And then tried my hand at consulting, but consulting as a form of self-employment only works if you ask for money, and I wasn't good at that. So
That
didn't work out. And people were telling me anyway that this thing I created needed to be enterprise software. And I knew enough to know that I couldn't, I would fail at software development too if I tried that. So I partnered with someone, and we created a company that is now called RiskLens, that has implemented FAIR in software. And at any rate, and then a few years ago too, I was presenting at RSA on risk, and in that case, root cause analysis around risk. And it was a pretty large audience. And one of my colleagues afterwards said, boy, the audience was really engaged. Where do they go to learn more? And I shrugged it. I don't know, a blog post somewhere. And so we started the FAIR Institute as a nonprofit to build a community of those in the security and risk management professions who are really focused on understanding the risk landscape in its, what I would characterize as its true form, and evolving the measurement and management practices around it, primarily based around FAIR and sort of FAIR derivatives.
Okay, let's dig into that a bit more in a moment. But going back to the conversations I've had with other CISOs over the last few weeks, we mentioned offline, and for those who've watched the series this week, you'll have all noticed that there's a common theme or common themes arising. And one of those that comes from the successful CISOs is the fact that they've managed to equate that risk in dollar terms to the board, or they've implemented processes that make that happen. And on the flip side of that, there's lots of other CISOs who I've spoken to offline who really, really struggle with that. So I'd like to try and focus on the FAIR methodology and how it can help people with that.
Sure. So FAIR is first and foremost, understand that FAIR is a model. It decomposes. It's an ontology that describes the elements, the factors that drive risk and their relationships to one another. And it looks very much like a Bayesian network for those who are familiar with Bayesian networks and statistics. And that structure then allows us to decompose these very complex problems we face. How much risk does this, that, or the other represent? We now have sort of a framework for critical thinking and evaluation that decomposes the problem into very understandable and measurable chunks, which then allows us to, of course, measure more effectively, more reliably, and then also show our homework. If we put these results in front of executives, the first few times you put quantitative cyber risk quantification results in front of business executives, they're going to want to know where the numbers came from. They've seen FUD before. They know fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And if the numbers are big, they're going to want to know. Yeah. And if you can't show your homework, it's going to be a very bad day. and fortunately, as I was first developing FAIR and using it to help make decisions in the organization, communicate with executives, that's exactly what I went through. People were asking very probing questions. And fortunately, because of FAIR, I could show my homework. Yeah. And that was crucial to gaining actually additional credibility, because prior to that, they were accepting of the fact that I was an expert in security, but they also assumed that I knew squat about risk, because all of their experiences with cybersecurity professionals before had been about vulnerabilities and threats and those sorts of things, and high, medium, low sorts of statements and such. And here was someone who can express things in economic terms, which they get, and can back it up. And so that helped me out in terms of, it boosted my credibility. And after a while, they quit probing because they assumed that I had my act together.
Well, they didn't have the fear, uncertainty, and doubt anymore, did they, Jack? Because they knew that you'd done the due diligence on the numbers.
Right. Yeah. And there was, of course, there's always uncertainty in the numbers, because you never have perfect information, and certainly in a problems place like ours. But I could explain also part of the process is evaluating, understanding, evaluating, and communicating the level of uncertainty in both the inputs and the outputs, which is something I think that very few people have stopped to think about. Because one of the problems I've seen in the past with sort of nascent attempts at cyber risk quantification is they bring a discrete value. Our risk is $300,000. No, it's not. That number may be in the range somewhere, but it ain't the number. There isn't a number.
And I mean, if I can just interject, I remember with 20 years in the investment business, when we talked about risk, we used to use, kind of funnels or funnel diagrams like this that showed the median line of the risk, but it'd also give you the parameters above, top side risk, bottom side risk as well.
And that's a critical piece of information, because as a decision maker, and I hope this resonates with you too, certainly tell me if it doesn't, but when making a decision, if there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, in some measurements, there will be far more uncertainty than others for various reasons. When there's a significant amount of uncertainty in the numbers, as a decision maker, I want to know that, because that affects my decision, right? If I don't understand the uncertainty in the results, I lose the opportunity to make a more calibrated decision. And so a lot of people, especially in my experience, at least in the cybersecurity field, they're driven towards precision. They want a number, you know, and unfortunately, and they're uncomfortable with anything that's not. And what they're missing this point about both realism, because again, that discrete value is not real. I mean, that's not realistic.
You can't have a definitive value for risk like that, especially not one that changes on a minute by minute basis, dependent upon the landscape as well.
Yeah, exactly. So what I think people need to do who are interested in cyber risk quantification is come to grips with the fact that there is uncertainty in the inputs, which means there's uncertainty in the outputs. Embrace that, understand it, embrace it. Be sure to communicate it faithfully to the people who are using these results in their decision making. And the fact that you can talk about the uncertainty in these measurements with these people who are used to it, because they're used to seeing it in the kinds of things you used to do. And it helps them be comfortable. the decision makers are actually more comfortable with the results when you can talk intelligently about the uncertainty in the measurements. So, again, that's a thing that, or dimension of the problem space that a lot of people haven't stopped to think about. And
just asking a question for anyone watching, really, who might be a CISO or a similar level, and they're using a kind of definitive risk number or dollar figure at the moment. Does the FAIR model help with the explanation of why there is the band up and above and the risk different changes? Because I think, again, that I want to be careful what I say here. Not everyone's got great emotional intelligence and soft skills who are in CISO positions, and negotiating and putting things across to board people who are more likely to have come from a market trader or a financial services background than a techie one can seem quite daunting. So I think, anything that can help people understand how to put that across would be amazing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of CISOs have expressed trepidation about using cyber risk quantification because they don't have a background in these sorts of things, and they're foreseeing uncomfortable conversations. And again, FAIR really can be a significant aid to that, in the sense that it enables you to show your homework and say, see this, the level of uncertainty in this result, this range of loss exposure we have here, it's because of these two data points down here that we have, frankly, crap information about, technical term, crap information. But
no.
But here's again, one of the values of evaluating risk in this way and communicating about it with uncertainty as part of the conversation. The things that are driving uncertainty very often are resolvable if we can, instead of having logging roll over after 30 days, let's retain our logging for a year, because then we'll have far more data to draw from in our estimates around the frequency of this or that, or the conditions of things. And so it allows you to not only express the uncertainty, but also talk about the sources of uncertainty and the options for dealing with them. And sometimes what I've found is that when you talk about the options for improving the precision on your measurements, sometimes executives no, I'm good with the imprecision we have. That's all the information I need to make the decision.
Because they understand that. Yeah.
And again, it's an opportunity to take the conversation somewhere. It will never go if all you take to them is, this is high risk or this is medium risk. You will never have the opportunity to have those conversations and again, calibrate decision-making, potentially significantly improve your sources of data for future decisions and analysis and those sorts of things.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Jack. One of the other things that's come up a lot this week, and it might be slightly instigated by me because it's a bit of a pet hate for me, so I will instigate it again on this chat. So you mentioned speaking at RSA. Most people who watch know that I've only been in the industry less than 2 years. RSA this year was my first conference. Went to Infosec Europe in London a few weeks after, and I'll be careful how I say this as well. There's lots of vendors out there who I clearly don't work for, because they'd be firing me this week if I did, who are using a lot of buzzwords, whether it's shift left or whether it's zero trust or whether they've got AI in their product or whatever else it might be. And then you take it back down to the entry level, I suppose, industry, where you've got people being led up the garden path, especially those transitioning from the military, for example, who get some money to retrain. In the UK and the US, I've seen this, where you've got unscrupulous boot camps out there promising you to become a cyber expert in 12 to 16 weeks and be on $100,000 a year job. So the whole industry at the moment, in my, I suppose, outside industry opinion, is it's still in its infancy. We've got like 3,500 products, so it's going through the stage of the massive growth where you get loads of stuff, which makes it very difficult. And at some point, hopefully, especially with the economy now heading the way it is, without wanting to get too doom and gloom, you'd hope to see there's a bit of a thinning out in the market there. But at the moment, I do feel that the narrative being pushed especially towards CISOs and decision makers who have the budget decisions for big enterprise level firms, are being pushed towards silver bullets rather than the people piece that's needed? And I'll stop rambling and let you answer that.
Yeah, your observations are spot on. The vendor floor is chock full of organizations who have the answer. And it's fascinating to me to have conversations with them. So for example, what I used to do as a CISO, and I've done it a couple of times on the vendor floor, but it's really not the forum for it. I'll be having a conversation with a vendor who has some solution that they're, of course, very excited about, as you would expect. And I'll ask them, so tell me, how does this reduce risk? And they can talk about vulnerabilities, and they can talk about threat intelligence and that sort of thing, but they can't really talk to, in real terms, certainly not in measurement terms, how it affects risk, which is, at the end of the day, my job as a CISO is to help my organization experience an acceptable frequency and magnitude of loss. There's never zero. So what you're aiming for is acceptable.
Yeah.
And first of all, you have to know what acceptable means to the business. But with that as a starting point, you then also need to measure where you are relative to that, and how things then enable you to improve your position relative to that objective and that sort of thing. All of that is about measurement, and it's all about risk. And if the vendor can't tell you specifically how their product helps you to reduce or manage risk in measurement terms, then you have to wonder if it's, first of all, if it's something you should invest in, but also, for me at least, when this is sort of the general position of the profession, that is a strong support for what something else you just said, which is we're still in our infancy as a profession. And there's other clues to that as well. So, for example, the word risk, which should be a fundamental term in our profession, right? It should have one definition. Everybody should be using it in that context, right? And I used to have a slide I'd present, and sometimes I still do, in presentations, where I list six things like disgruntled insider, cyber criminal, an unpatched server, a database full of sensitive customer information. I'll ask the audience, which of these are risks? And the answer has always been, well, they're all risks. And I'll go, no, none of them are risks. They're all a part of the risk landscape. They all contribute to how much risk, but as soon as we conflate them and make this fundamental term ambiguous, we lose any opportunity to measure those things, to compare those things, right, and to therefore manage those things effectively. And so when our profession, and we can use the word vulnerability is also a term that's used all over the place, threat, incident versus event. All these fundamental terms to our profession are used, profoundly and consistently, which means we're young as a profession. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but it's something we need to be aware of. And every other profession we think of as mature, maybe some of the sciences like physics or mathematics or medicine, all of these other professions went through a similar stage, yes, right? And they evolved out of it, but they evolved out of it over decades or centuries. We don't have the luxury of decades or centuries. We have to get our act together now. And terminology, it's not sexy. Nobody's going to want to be the terminology nerd in their organization, right? But if we don't address that as a profession, the measurement problem is just exacerbated. So yeah, we're a new profession. We have a lot to learn. And sometimes I think, again, to sort of your example on the vendor floor, we mistake technical sophistication for maturity as a profession. They're not the same things, not even remotely the same.
That That is a really good point. Yeah, because just because it's shiny bells and whistles and got AI in it doesn't mean
Yeah,
it's.
and we could have, frankly, a long conversation about AI.
Yeah.
It's, as you said, it's a buzzword, but I think people attribute efficacy, associate efficacy with it, which that's a sinkhole that again we could have a long conversation about, and there are other people more qualified to have a conversation about it with you than I am. But I think the industry and especially the vendors need to take a chill pill around AI and understand it better before they make claims about it or before they put too much faith in it.
Again, it's about the data, isn't it? It hasn't been around long enough.
Yeah,
To know
yeah,
we're already seeing biases in AI through obviously
absolutely.
the human programming aspect, which is feeding it in. And unfortunately, I can't see how we're going to get away from that.
Yeah, it's going to be
interesting.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. But long story short, AI has amazing potential, but I have not seen anything today that gives me any faith in the AI that our industry is applying right now.
No.
Now, I haven't seen everything, so it isn't to say that someone somewhere hasn't carved a specific enough niche, where they have the data, right? And when we think about that, I mean, when we think about our problem space and how broad and complex and nuanced it is, right? And the fact that the data we have available only covers a small fraction of that problem space. Okay, so you have to carve a pretty narrow niche there, in my view, to make any realistic claim of applying reliable AI. Again, well, I'm happy to be proven wrong on that, but
I think a couple of things there. Firstly, Splodge asked a question before, although you've answered it over the last few minutes. I don't think you'd noticed that he'd asked it, and it said, "Does the industry overcomplicate the view on risk?" Clearly, yes. Which is what we've been talking about. I think the other comment I've had from CISOs the last few weeks has been about not wanting to plug more stuff into stuff they've already got, and that seems to be a frustration. And if we want to look at one of the buzzwords, I suppose, or buzzwords, shift left terminology, the main players, again, I'm not going to name names because I'm not, the main players in the market are selling SAST and DAS scanners. The narrative is being pushed by them with the shift left, but they're not really shifting that far left. And from everyone I've spoken to who has a successful, I suppose, application security or DevSecOps program, it's not about plug-in things. It's about relationships between the developer team and the security team, and education and awareness. And there's other words like security champions, which can clearly work in the right circumstances. But when someone's given the title no extra pay but loads of extra responsibility to tick a box, again, it's going back to that being driven by the narrative of the vendors. And I wonder how we're going to address that, because also you've got lots of enterprise firms out there with lots of different products they're paying an awful lot of money for. And I equate this back, I keep doing this because it's the only reference point I've got, but to financial services and some of the platforms we used to use. You pay these license fees out. None of the staff ever get properly trained on them. You end up using 5 to 10% of the functionality, but they just sit there until you plug something else in. And again, it's that narrative that needs to change, I think.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, our profession, at least in some circles, talks a lot about sort of the human element and how important it is, right? But I don't see us very often really digging into that and understanding it really well. The more I've looked at that dimension of our problem space, the more fundamental I found it to be. And there are things that we don't tend to focus on that can have a significant effect and that aren't something you plug into the network. And that's incentives. mean, people focus on and perform best at the things that they're incentivized on, that they're measured on. And you'll find that in many organizations, the CISO is certainly measured on risk, on the state of the cybersecurity program anyway. And they've probably rolled some of that down in their organization, where people are, maybe incentivized on various measurements. But outside of the security organization, it's rare in my experience to find people or organizations that are incentivizing people in the business. So, for example, one of the biggest successes I had as a CISO, and I didn't accomplish this by myself. I had help from people who are more politically adept than I was. Let me put it that way. And that was, we got the CEO's cabinet members, their compensation was tied to security objectives. Imagine what that took. Okay. Yeah. But imagine the effect that had. We didn't miss any objective, not even close that year. And what was fascinating is it spilled over into other dimensions of the security program that weren't part of those specific metrics they were up against. It was just this general osmosis, if you will, of, yeah, this stuff's important to me, so now it's important to you, going throughout the organization. And it was just fascinating to see that effect. And other things I've had happen in my organizations where things like very specific, and virtually all organizations today have a security awareness training program. It's the mom and apple pie stuff about passwords, access privileges, phishing, these sorts of things. But very few organizations, and you begin to see, or I've seen, of course, there's a lot more focus on developers receiving, software engineers receiving training on writing secure software, and that's great. Whether or not they're actually measured on that and incentivized against it is another question. Yeah. But so in a couple of organizations where I was CISO, we created education awareness programs specifically for subsets of the population. Our network engineers, our system engineers, executive admins, executives, separate things that training regimens for them that focused on the things that were specific to how they could affect security positively or negatively. And for those people in the IT organizations, we actually were able to set it up such that they had to take tests on this every year. And if they failed the test, they couldn't work until they passed the test. They lost their privileges. And newcomers coming on board had to pass the test before they were given privileges to do the work they've been hired for. And that drives home, those sorts of conditions, if you will, drives home the fact that this stuff's important. We take it seriously. We're measuring you against this stuff. And we would, of course, things like hitting patching SLAs and that sort of thing was a part of what was measured. People were measured on. But there's a dimension to that too that, of course, comes back to those CEO cabinet members who agreed to have because they had to agree to have their compensation attached to security objectives. They had to understand those objectives really well. What are they? And they had to agree that they were important, which came back to me being able to talk about it in terms of risk.
Yeah.
Okay. And because I could do that, they understood what those objectives were and how they and their organizations affected those objectives. That's when they agreed to it. Okay. And the same thing, even down the ladder, the IT folks and such, they had to understand, the risk implications and how their actions affected those things. So, having those conversations, and especially when we're talking about patching, a lot of organizations that I'm familiar with really struggle with hitting SLAs around patching.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? Their SLAs are wrong. Okay. And their SLAs are wrong generally because they're measuring the significance of the vulnerabilities wrong. Right. So in one of my roles as a CISO, our organization was struggling with the same thing. Couldn't hit the patching SLAs to save our soul. So I took a look at, when I became aware of this, I said, okay, let's take a look at those SLAs. Well, first of all, they were following the CVSS scores religiously. If it says it's critical, then it's critical and it has to meet that SLA. And that meant there were thousands of things, tens of thousands of things that needed to be patched in 7 days or whatever it was. No, I think it was 30 days. At any rate, some time period. Couldn't get close to it. So we implemented a process to filter those critical findings so that we could winnow out the things that really mattered, because CVSS is blind to things like the placement. Is the asset facing an active threat landscape versus being deep in the bowels of the network? Are there compensating controls? How valuable is the asset? These sorts of things. CVSS doesn't know any of that.
I mean, you could even go as far as looking at the ones which are being actively exploited, couldn't you? Because they
absolutely. That's
I've seen this again, coming from a non-cyber background. The amount of this I've seen with companies frantically trying to patch all these vulnerabilities, but what they haven't done is actually dug down deep underneath them. And to be fair to some vendors, I have seen, whether they're any good or not, and I'm not going to mention names, but I have seen a couple come in, 2 or 3 come in the last year, which
there are some, and the one, I won't mention names, but there are a couple that really have done a good job of, especially that sort of winnowing out based on whether things are being actively exploited. They still aren't, at least as far as I'm aware, identifying sort of where the asset sits relative to the threat landscape or the value liability perspective. Or
this is a non-techie question, and it might be stupid, but do the risks become industry specific when it comes down to the vulnerabilities as well? So do certain things face more, or is that?
Maybe to some extent. So industries, for example, that are really sensitive to outages.
Yeah.
Okay. So vulnerabilities that allow, a denial of service attack, to occur, those sorts of things are perhaps going to be more relevant to those industries, that sort of thing. Other than that, I haven't looked at that closely enough, but there might be, that could be another opportunity to do even better filtering. But the bottom line was, when we actually filtered our vulnerabilities through these different perspectives, we were able to get the number of critical vulnerabilities down so low that we actually shortened our patching SLA, and we hit it every time. Okay, so we were wasting less energy, right?
Yeah.
And protecting ourselves better by, actually a little critical thinking.
It's something that might be a little bit lacking in this industry. Where would you go to learn critical thinking, though, Jack? I think if only there was a Udemy course.
Yeah, I think there is.
Well, I'm sure there is. Yeah, but whether a 12-week course is going to give you that or not, I don't.
Ideally, you get it in your education, right? Through from kindergarten on through university, and I, at least speaking for the schools I went through in the USA growing up, critical thinking was not on the agenda.
It's the same in the UK. I mean, I was privately educated until I was, I think, just about 14. And the difference between that, where critical thinking was a huge part of it, as was Latin, which I've never used, to be honest. I think that was if you go into the medical profession. But compared to the lack of that kind of those social skills, the soft skills, the essential skills that are not taught in mainstream schools. I'm conscious that I'm gabbling on a bit, and we've got people jumping in for questions. So let's jump on one of those quickly. Splodge has put one here. Here we go. Should governments set better guidelines, or do you think that would just create other issues? Good question, Splodge.
It's a great question. I would love for the regulatory agencies or government or even industry coalitions to begin setting expectations, whether it's a law or a standard or what. I'm not sure what the best approach is, but so risk measurement is historically done so badly in our profession, and we can, if you want, I can go into that a little bit more in a minute. But we're so bad at it, and the expectations are, I mean, they practically don't exist. If you're a cybersecurity professional, you can measure risk, right? And I'm sorry, but no. You can't measure risk reliably. I mean, you can measure risk, but is it worth spit? I don't know. So we have to set expectations. I think we have to set risk measurement as a distinct discipline or skill within the role within the organization. And I certainly did when I was a CISO. I mean, if you hadn't been trained in risk measurement, and I provided training to anybody in the organization who wanted it. If you hadn't been through that program and you said something was high, medium, or low risk, I discounted it almost completely because I knew that it wasn't based on anything but this.
Yeah.
So we have to get beyond that, and so expectations regarding how risk is measured. And setting expectations that the people who are assigned the responsibility of measuring risk have actually had some training in it.
I think one of the other problems I see with that splodge is the divided, divisive world that we live in now, and the fact that it's not just one government that needs to introduce this. We kind of need some common theme throughout, and at the moment, the way the world's going, doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon, in my opinion. But we won't get into the political war landscape because I mentioned that the other day and we went off on a tangent. The next question, Tony, how are you, my friend? Tony's desperate to meet you, by the way, Jack. I think he's messaged you already. He sent me a message last night saying how excited he was. So I don't know if he told you, but he's got your book. He's been recommended your book and he's been working his way through the book. Tony is an amazing person, similar age to myself, Tony. We're not spring chickens, are we? But we've both come into this industry pretty quickly. And I suppose, I mean, I'm approaching 50. I think Tony's the same. And he's hit the ground running hard. And he's brought all his business experience from running businesses before and the customer service aspect and all of those things to this industry. And I mean, he's flying, and I'm really, really pleased for you, Tony. But he's asked you a tricky one here, and we might not be able to answer it in 10 minutes, but I'll let you have a go.
Yeah. So first of all, in my book, there's a large section on using FAIR semi-qualitatively, using a matrix sort of approach, and that can act as a really nice bridge for organizations that want to eventually maybe get into cyber risk quantification, but they've been living with the wet finger in the air and the red, yellow, green forever. And that's what they're used to, and that's what they understand and such. So you can use FAIR qualitatively. And in fact, when I first developed it, I used it qualitatively because I hadn't figured out the quantitative dimension yet. And even with that, even just using FAIR qualitatively, we were able to reduce by an order of magnitude the number of high-risk things in our risk register because we were able to winnow out stuff that had erroneously been labeled high risk, and which also, again, gained us a lot of credibility with the executives because we were no longer Chicken Little calling everything high risk. Yeah. And we could talk about it more deeply. Anyway, so this can actually be a really useful bridge. Use the FAIR ontology and nomenclature to refine mental models and to improve the discussion around risk and improve the critical thinking around risk, and qualitative measurements, for all their inherent flaws, and there are many, can still be useful as sort of a very gross expression of whatever it is you're measuring. just understand its limitations, but then you can take a step even beyond that and use what I describe in the book, which is each in a qualitative method, whether it's red, yellow, green, or 1 through 5 scale. There's it's one of those. Here's a pet peeve of mine. I'm going to take a tangent here. A lot of people think that if I use a number, I'm quantifying. That ain't true. If there's no unit of measurement, right, like a percentage or dollar figure or a frequency or something like that, it's not quantitative. You can number there's all. And so people will think a 1 through 5 scale or a credit-like score, of 760 is quantitative. No, it's numeric. It's not quantifying anything. All right. So anyway, but if you take your ordinal scale, and let's say we're just doing red, yellow, green, and you assign, instead of describing what red means in words like, well, red means high, which means, significant amount of loss or whatever, right? You're using qualitative terms to describe a qualitative value. Instead of that, using a range, high loss magnitude means between, $1 million and $10 million.
Yeah.
Right. It's not ambiguous. Right. And you're still able to refer to these words or colors, things that people used to, but they map back to actual quantitative ranges.
Something tangible.
It reduces a lot of the ambiguity. It allows you to do very rudimentary sort of mathematics against it and still defend the results. So that's I think perhaps a good opportunity to start the journey. In an organization that isn't willing to jump in feet first, wants to dip their toes in the waters, start using FAIR as again a framework for critical thinking and for normalizing mental models and nomenclature and sort of better understanding the loss event scenarios, the risks that your organization faces. And with that as a starting point, then the rest sort of snowballs over time because you begin to realize the benefits from that pretty quickly.
That's really good points. I think for me, what I'm drawing out of this, or what I've been thinking while you've been saying that, is the massive gap we've got in the SME sector for people engaging with the security first mindset. And I only know the UK numbers, but I know in the UK we've got something called Cyber Essentials, which is a very low level entry point tick box kind of assessment for cyber. And I think the stats I saw, which were about 3 months ago, is that the take up rate was 1% of our SMEs. And again, I don't see how perhaps going through a tick box exercise, whilst it might help you with your insurance and might give you a little bit of an idea, I think you really have got to start at the bottom and work your way up. And having a model to do that, the FAIR model, I mean, I've ordered the book, so I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to dig deep in it because I think there's a lot of correlation between what I used to do in financial services to the risk aspect as well. And I mean, it definitely helps me. I mentioned it earlier, there's lots of CEOs who come from that background as well. And if you can speak that language about risk tolerances, risk bands, and I think it makes a huge difference. Tony said, so gently adding a financial value to the matrix already in place, then take it deeper once they're comfortable seeing financials against risk. Good point. I suppose we've got about 10 minutes left. We've talked about loads of the issues that we've got in the industry. We've talked about some of the ways to solve them. What's the next 5 years? What are the biggest challenges for the industry? And I suppose the other question off the back of that, to give you two at once, is how do we solve the mess that we've got, or is it going to solve itself?
It'll solve itself eventually. Darwin will rule, right?
Yeah.
But that takes a tremendous amount of time. And I would argue that we don't have that kind of time given the threat landscape and the reliance upon technology that the world has. So, there has to be a more concerted effort around understanding and normalizing risk in more realistic and measurable terms and those sorts of things. I think people have to, I think as a profession, and I know probably a lot of the people who watch your program, what I'm about to say doesn't really reflect them, because I suspect you have a fairly special audience. But a lot of people in the profession tend to see things in very black and white terms, and our problem space is anything but black and white. There's a tremendous amount of gray, and there has to be an open-mindedness that doesn't come easily. There are lots of studies that say that show how tightly people hold on to their beliefs, even after being shown,
I could give loads of real-world examples of that at the moment, but I won't.
Yeah. Right. So, and unfortunately, well, our profession is made up of humans, and for all the wonderful aspects of that, it also brings along some of those challenges and sort of the tribal thinking and the reluctance to entertain new ideas and those sorts of things. So, but the good news is that the tide is shifting. So when I first developed FAIR in early 2000s, and I published my first white paper in 2005 on it, and to give you a sense of the reaction it got, it was incredibly polarizing. I had a number of people reach out to me and say how clarifying it was and how useful it was and all that good stuff. But I also got an email from one guy who was a big name in the industry. I won't name him because he's not in a position to defend himself anymore. But he sent me an email saying I should be charged with criminal negligence for having developed and published FAIR. Because in his view, the word risk should be stricken from the English language. It's not measurable. And the only way to manage it is to, and this is a quote, the only way to manage it is to do exactly what he says. Yeah, so it was, there was a range of reaction. So, at any rate, but the prevailing belief then was that cyber risk could not be measured quantitatively, right? And so if we use 2005 as a starting point for sort of introduction of FAIR, for the first 10 years, I would say that was, 9 or more people out of 10 that you'd talk to would have that belief. And then in the 20-teens, we began to see more like, okay, maybe it can be, but it's really hard. And is it really any better? And how do you, and that sort of thing. And over the years, that's begun to change. And now the question is leaning much more strongly into, even though there are still people out there who say it can't be done or that it's too hard or those sorts of things, and they can never defend their position. It's just hilarious. Anyway, now it's more like, okay, how do we do this? And how do we do it? How do we learn more? How do we do it? How do we adopt it? These sorts of things. And with that, though, of course, comes the concerns we talked about earlier, where people are going, okay, this could be really useful and important, but I'm worried about the first time I take it in front of the executives, am I going to get beat up, or made to look bad and those sorts of things. And I understand the concern. I mean, I had those very same concerns when I was first doing this, but those concerns can, your exposure to that bad day can be managed. They're very effective strategies for making sure that you come out of those conversations in one piece. So, but the good news is that tide has begun to shift, and because we're a herd species, right? So previously, the herd was against this. It was like, if you were doing this, you're not one of us.
Yeah.
right? And that's going to become reversed eventually. And I would love to think it's within 5 years, but I'm not going to hold my breath. If you're not doing cyber risk quantification, you're a dinosaur, and what the hell are you doing in this industry?
I think to speak about someone you mentioned earlier, which was Darwinism, whether this phrase was actually him or not, it's been attributed to him, but I think it's not the strongest nor fittest of the species that will survive, but the most adaptable to change. And it's very true especially in this industry, which changes every moment. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. Just going back to, we were talking about a couple of flippant Simon comments here. So we're talking about AI. I want to just touch on venture capitalists and private equity firms, because going back to the tech boom a few years back, we saw massive investments from VCs and PEs into firms with no real underlying fundamental value. And we're seeing it again, Jack, now, in my opinion. There's a lot of people like me who've come into the industry really keen. They've seen issues and they wanted to solve them. And I did this with the community last year, and I was throwing up courses for this. I was getting people to build boxes. In reality, what I've learned is the community can never be that. We've got enough training. We've got enough people doing that. But what it is a place to support each other. So it's a community, and it has to stay that, I think. But one of the biggest problems that we have as a community is finding the right resources, and it's such a minefield out there of different training that we're now going to try and put something together that helps with the psychometric profiling at the start to make sure they're in the right job. We can then look at, whether it's ISC squared, the new entry level exam for those trying to break in, and trying to give people some guidance, because we're getting this bit wrong as well, right? We're getting the bit wrong where we're bringing people in, because as much as certificates are super important, and yes, I did fail my OSCP a couple of years ago. Certificates do demonstrate the ability to learn, but there doesn't seem to be any common ground between the recruiting and hiring process and people trying to come in. And people like myself, like Tony, people who are a little bit older, who bring a lot of experience from different areas, are struggling to get in. And that to me is quite frustrating. So we seem to have a lot of people reinventing the wheel, loads of people coming in and thinking I can fix that, and building something that's the same as something else. And I suppose the question is, when does that stop? When do we get to saturation point for these products? And will it be economy driven when that stops? Maybe when the VCs and PEs start to fail to see their returns like they did back in 2000.
Yeah, probably that'll be it. But I think that VCs and PEs maybe are also placing too much faith in they're mistaking technical sophistication for maturity and efficacy. So, for example, a VC reached out to me not too long ago because they were looking at investing in a cyber risk quantification vendor. And they wanted, someone else's perspective on the discipline and that sort of thing. And they told me which vendor it was, and I was familiar with them. And I said, well, they've got a beautiful dashboard, and a really slick user interface, but the results are absolutely indefensible. I mean, they're not even remotely accurate or reliable. And I explained, why. and that's an example of a vendor who understands user interface and that sort of thing, but doesn't understand the fundamentals of what they're trying to do. In this case, quantify cyber risk, but it could be, some other part of our technology solution space where we understand it technically, but we don't understand it contextually.
Yeah.
From a business value perspective, and making sure. And I had another example is a number of years ago, I had a vendor reach out to me. They'd heard about FAIR, and they said, "Oh, we want to measure the risk reduction value of our technology and use that in our marketing." So they came to me and they paid me. They said, "We'd like to pay you to do an evaluation of our technology so that and tell us this risk reduction value." I said, happy to do it. I can't guarantee the outcome,
That
but
you're
I'm
like,
happy to do it.
yeah.
And I did the analysis, and the reason they came to me is they were having trouble selling it, right? Technology. And they thought, well, this will be the key. And I did the analysis, and I said, actually, your product really doesn't reduce risk hardly at all, and certainly not to cover the cost of it. But here are the things you could do to improve that. Yeah, they did. They didn't come back for a second round. I don't understand. But
Yeah.
at any rate, again, I think until a vendor can help me to understand the risk reduction value of their technology, I'm really not going to be all that interested. So I think the vendors need to begin to understand that dimension of our problem space. Which again, risk is the context for everything we do. I mean, if we're doing something as a profession that isn't either reducing risk or improving the efficacy in our reduction of risk, why the hell are we doing it?
Because it's the definition of insanity to continue doing the same thing that you're doing, expect different results.
Well, yeah, and that could take us down another route, maybe a future conversation about root cause analysis, which is something else our profession doesn't do.
No, Jack, I've just noticed the time. We're over time. I know you're super busy, and I'm going to seize on the fact that you mentioned you might come back. So let's.
If you'll have me, yeah.
No, I'll definitely have you, and I'd love to talk about. I'd love to talk about that. It's a huge issue that people seem to think they understand, but they don't. It's also something that I understand a bit more about myself, so it'll be refreshing for me to speak about a topic. Because at the moment, I mean, I've said to the previous guest this week, I've learned more in the last 3 or 4 weeks from speaking to our industry's leaders and having these conversations than I have in the last 2 years of picking up books and, going to conferences. And I think the only way this industry can change is if more people stand up and talk about the issues in a way like this, where it isn't vendor driven, because a lot of the narrative we see out there on podcasts and YouTube shows is vendor driven. And I say that with a sponsor for the show, but it's not forcing down people's throats. It's brand awareness, which hopefully will help. And plus, that our sponsor is a technical cyber consultancy who embed people into security teams and develop those relationships. And that's why I joined them, Jack, because there's not many firms out there like that. And let's come back to all these topics again. I'd love to have you back on in a few weeks. Everyone who's watched, again, thank you so much for tuning in. I know it's early in the US, so I do appreciate you jumping in for this. Jack, massive thank you for your time today. So it's really appreciated. And for those of you that are watching, please do like and subscribe to the content. We'll be back next week. We've got 4 or 5 live streams next week. I'm now going to take a well-deserved 2 days off, put my feet in the paddling pool and spend some time with the children. So from me, it's a massive thanks and see you later. Jack, again, thank you so much. And we'll see you all soon.
Take care.